All right. Another big issue these days is climate change,
Mm.
environmental protection in general. I'm wondering what your plan and Joe Jorgensen's plan looks like for, what does the federal government have any place in dictating what businesses are allowed to put in the water, put in the air, and then national parks. What do you think about national parks? Is that something that fits into the government's role? And then if you want to expand a little farther, there's a lot of giant agribusiness and corporate farming that goes on that really destroys the environment. And how can we get our farming system back to a more decentralized, localized system? So if you could just kind of, that's a pretty broad topic,
Yeah,
but
there's
just
a few things there, but again, the short answer, and there will be a common theme here that we can all build. And I like to show people what the common theme is, and then that helps them on something that I didn't answer. They're usually able to figure out, oh, this is probably what he would think about that based on that common theme. Again, common theme. Federal government got involved in something and made it worse because they took centralized control and tried to impose a top-down system that hurt the little guy and made it so that local solutions can't happen. And also, again, the big cronies get to step in and use it as another federal trough for them to make a fortune without really having to provide any value. All they have to do, really all they have to do, is just buy off the politicians and hand them legislation and the talking points to use to push it through Congress and or to sign it as president. And then make sure that their favored lobbyists end up in charge of the various regulatory authorities to make sure that they stay nice and wealthy off of all this. Perfect example with the environment. Really with all three of those examples, but we'll start with the environment. Here's what the EPA does. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency does. First thing they do is they create a bunch of regulations, environmental regulations. And these environmental regulations just so happen to be so hard to comply with that small businesses and medium-sized businesses whose business can be affected by these regulations usually just go out of business. They just can't do it. Very few of them can do it, or their costs go up so much that they're not really able to compete with the larger companies who can absolutely afford compliance with the regulations that they wrote and
right.
handed to the politicians to sign into office. They already knew what they were because they came up with them. Here's the next thing that happens. When those now that the other people are out of business, we just have the larger companies, which also are the largest polluters, right?
Right.
When that large polluter has a spill or a leak or a pipeline leak or a spill from one of their tankers, or they release a bunch of toxic sludge into our rivers and lakes, here's what the EPA does. They give them a slap on the wrist fine, and slap on the wrist indicates you can feel it. It's more like a eyelash on the edge of your wrist of a fine. They'll fine them a few $100 million or a few $1 billion for something that saved the company tens of billions of dollars in doing it that way instead of disposing of it properly. So it
Right.
actually saved them money and doesn't factor in the trillions of dollars, sometimes immeasurable damage and economic damage, not to mention just the cost of human suffering that you can't even put a price on, but just the economic property damage that's been done as a result of this. Sometimes trillions, tens of trillions, definitely in the hundreds of billions most of the time. And they're given a pennies on the dollar fine. And then they're indemnified against lawsuits. You can't sue them because the federal government said, no, 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 we already took care of this. We fined them. Everything's fine. You can't sue them. And here's why. Because if you sued them, they'd go out of business. They would have to liquidate their company. And because it was a criminal action, you'd be able to sue them personally too. So it wouldn't just be the company that would be sued. It would be all of the principals involved, all the CEOs and all the main heads of the company. They would also get sued and they'd also lose everything.
Right.
Good. Good. If you
Yeah.
just did that, especially if you did it intentionally, but if you did it through severe negligence, good. You should lose everything. Your company should no longer exist. All of that should be liquidated to try to pay off the damage that you just did. And more importantly, or I guess the point of it is that knowledge that if you mess up, you're going to lose everything would make you self-regulate in ways that are way more effective and efficient and dynamic than anything the government hands you in the form of a regulation. You yourself will figure out how not to F this up even once, right? So
Right.
they protect them against lawsuits so that doesn't happen. And then here's the last thing they do. They make you pay for the cleanup. They
Right.
externalize that cost to you, who probably are also the victim of that damage. So when these big oil spills happen, it affects all of us. We were all affected by the BP Gulf oil spill, right? Most of the country is affected when, these big sludge pours happen into, like the Mississippi or something, and it affects all those states. Like that affects everyone. That affects large swaths of this country, and they're the ones that have to pay for the cleanup.
Right.
And they're the ones being told you don't get to sue anyone. And they're the ones being told you can't even go into business because you can't even comply with these laws, even though you wouldn't even have the size or the wherewithal to pollute in the same way that these larger competitors are with you having to pay it off when it happens. You get the
Right.
EPA out of it, and you simply allow people to sue. That's it. You put these standards in place and say you can't do this, you can't do that. That's property damage. Really, you don't even need environmental regulations because in every single state, it's against the law to dump sludge. You could just have that. It's against the law. You can't do it. And any damage that's done, you can be sued for it. That's it. You make it where they can be sued, where they would lose everything, and where they could be held criminally liable as well. They won't do it. There won't need to be some massive multi-billion-dollar agency that gets you to pay off the cost, or that tells you that you can't sue them, or that tells you that you can't go into business because you can't afford the cost of complying with it. They don't do any of that. Instead, someone screws up and they have to pay for it. Whether they're big, they're little, whatever, they have to pay for it. And that reality will make them a lot more responsible than they are as due to a regulation. Now, when it comes to the parks, the founders never intended for the federal government to own most of the land in this country. Or even a large, plurality of the land in this country. The government is supposed to own federal buildings and military bases, and I guess the area around the National Mall and all those federal property, like the buildings and things they need like that, the White House and stuff. It's not supposed to own most of Nevada. It's not supposed to own large sections of Arizona and California. It's not supposed to own these huge swaths of land. That is, according to the 10th Amendment, best left to the states or the people. What we have seen both here and in other countries is that stewardship, good conservatorship and stewardship usually is better done by private owners who have a vested interest in preserving the natural resources on that land. So if, for example, groups wanted to step in and say, hey, listen, we want to take over this park with the idea that, under contract, we agree to, preserve it and take care of it and make sure that it's well kept and everything. They'll come up with far more dynamic solutions than will come from government because it belongs to them. And with that ownership comes a vested interest in preserving it, right? So that's the best way to deal with it. But at the very least, it needs to be decentralized to the states and preferably to the people in the spirit of the 10th Amendment. That will lead to less cost. We just had a situation right now where they finally funded to the tune of, I think it was $20 billion or something. They finally funded after decades all of the infrastructural needs that are needed in these national parks, bridges and roads and upkeep of buildings and everything, stuff that's been falling apart for as long as many of us have been alive. And they finally funded it. And it took forever. And even though there are, surprise, surprise, large crony corporations that are going in and doing, drilling on some of these lands and doing logging and all sorts of other stuff, and yet they were not able to get the funding to be able to take care of this stuff. If it were privately owned or managed by the states, they wouldn't be able to afford to float that, and it would have to be taken care of by the people who are making money off of the actual land itself, because they'd have to. So that's the best way to handle that. Finally, farming. You're going to be shocked when you hear what I have to say. Crony businesses have created a system with the Department of Agriculture that has increasingly necessitated farms to coalesce together or to fold and become a part of a larger agribusiness company, because the cost of compliance is increasingly high and the payouts are going to the people who have the best lobbyists. So the original idea of the Department of Agriculture is that they would help the everyday farmers to be able to get ahead. And that's not what's happening. The major payouts are going to massive farms that are making tens of billions of dollars a year in farming. And in similar ways, in concert with the EPA, They are indemnified against lawsuits. The cost of their environmental and property damage is externalized to taxpayers at both the federal and state level. It's almost like when you give powerful people nearly unlimited power to control what the government says about them, that they end up abusing that and using it for their own profit at your direct expense. And that's what's happened with the Federal Department of Agriculture. You get the USDA out of it. You get the cronies out of it. You get the pandering and craven politicians out of it, and you free the market again. Because it is not a free market. It is a increasingly closed command economy market that benefits the most powerful. It benefits those who have favors that they can pull in Washington, that has their bought and paid for politicians in Washington and in the state capitals as well. You get rid of that, and again, you put the power back in the hand of the people, and you'll still have large farms. I'm not saying it's all going to be mom and pop, old McDonald farms, but it's certainly going to be a much more diverse agricultural sector, because now the smaller farms that right now are not able to afford to comply with the cost of being in that business, now they can afford it. Now they can be a small farm. Now they don't have to spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars just in compliance costs, not including taxes and things like that. Just the cost of complying, just the cost of demonstrating that they're complying with the law. Get rid of that. Now you have a much more free market. Now a lot of those big businesses aren't going to be as big, and more importantly, again, stop indemnifying them against lawsuits. That is pure cronyism, and it allows these companies to abuse us and our land and our property and our rights and our environment and our air that we all share and everything else. Because now, again, they know they can get sued and lose everything if they keep screwing up. So that's how you deal with that.